I present to you our speaker, Sara Wuska, a narrative of the history of the first 25 years of Vestavia Hills.
The story of a city, unless it's told by an author or professional historian, would be from the perspective of that individual who was telling it, I feel sure. But in my attempts to be certain that I have the credentials for the facts that I'm telling you, I've consulted the council minutes, the history book by Dr. Marvin Whiting, Vestavia Hills, A Place Apart, newspaper interviews, oral interviews, presentations to the Historical Society by early residents, and my personal observances. Now, this narrative is not complete. It is flawed in that there's no way to recognize and give credit to the hundreds and hundreds who have given so much time and energy and talent and money and compassion to make this place, a place that we, like the place that we call home. Now, there's one other thing I want to tell you before I begin. It is your judgment as to whether developer Charles Bird fulfilled his dream and his goal. The family of Charles Bird called him a dreamer, the developer. It was his dream to build a place for a good life in the forest filled with beautiful dogwoods on the top of Shays Mountain. Now, in 1946, he acquired some 100 acres from the land holdings of the Smire estate, and he began to plan and build his dream community that he would name Vestavia Hills. Now, this was 75 years before, this was 75 years after the founding of Birmingham down in Jones Valley in 1971. The population, 1871, the population grew and spread out, and then up and over Red Mountain, and then all through Chase Valley, where two vibrant cities were thriving. But folks just didn't get on up to that top of that mountain that became original Vestavia Hills. Well, the way in was almost inaccessible. It was up a narrow, rutted, steep,
I wonder, can we do something with the mic?
steep, hairpin, curvy dirt road, the Montgomery Highway. But that doesn't mean that there weren't those who knew about and were interested in this beautiful place. And Birmingham attorney Edgar Jones Smire was one of them. He began buying up land in the early 1900s, and he soon owned hundreds of acres on the mountain. In 1915, he began to have a survey made for a road to be built into the site where he wanted to build his home. He came in off Cahaba Road, which is US 280 today, and built some 3.5 very circuitous miles to and in around the site. But World War I came along and everything was put on hold. And in 1921, he actually began construction. And it strikes me that this was not only after the end of the war, but after that great Spanish flu pandemic, probably. Well, his home was built of native stone that was quarried in the area. And in February of 1922, Mr. and Mrs. Smire moved into their beautiful Rockhurst. Now, the significance of this is that this is the first dwelling that our author could find recorded in the area that became early Vestavia Hills. But now, beginning in the 1920s, which was 100 years ago, of course, a few of the brave and the daring and the adventuresome and the independent spirits did begin to make their way up that road to the mountain. A few of them built homes, estates along the crest, mainly along the crest, but the majority of them built smaller frame or rock houses, either along or in close proximity to that Montgomery Highway, that rutted Montgomery Highway. Some of the names you still recognize today, just a few I mentioned: Moat, Strozier, Bearden, Maddox. Walter and Annie Moat came in 1923, and his brothers soon followed him, and they owned 80 acres in the Post Oak, Highfield Drive, Mission Road area. And some of that was the only tillable land on the mountain. And later on they began some truck farming, which was greatly appreciated by their more rock-bound neighbors. Now, Mr. Roy Maddox's home was where Honeybake Town and those adjacent shops are today. And he was very active later on in the formation of the city and served 8 years as council president. But there's one family I want to tell you a bit about, because Dr. Whiting, our historian, identified them as having the first owning the first business on the mountain. Leonard and Rosa Terrell came with their 4 children in 1925. Leonard had been wanting to get out of the city for the longest. He wanted to raise some chickens and pigs and maybe a cow and have a garden, hopefully. He worked with a man at the railroad who knew Mr. Marable, who was already living on the mountain, sawmilling and building houses. In fact, a good many of those people came to enter the sawmilling business. I believe that was the first reason for the Moats and the Stroziers coming. Well, Mr. Marable had a house for sale, and so Leonard worked with him and made a swap arrangement, but it was not a final agreement until Rosa had a deal with Mr. Marable that he would transport her children to and from Shade's Cahaba School as he drove his 3 daughters back and forth to Howard College. Well, as the Depression worsened, Leonard lost his job with the railroad, and they were about to lose their house. But Rosa made an arrangement with Mr. Yielding's bank downtown, and she bought lumber from an old building that Mr. Marable owned, and they built a country store in front of their property, built a kitchen in the back so she could sell barbecue and some other short order food, and they had a gas tank and sold kerosene. Leonard bought a car and learned to drive because he had been riding his motorcycle up and down that great highway back and forth on his way to the railroad. Leonard, after he learned to drive, he taught his daughter Catherine and a son, and Catherine went back and forth to Homewood to stock up on supplies for the store. And then Leonard bought a truck, and he and his son hauled coal, and they quarried some of that sandstone on the back of their lot. And Rosa said that they made out very well during the Depression. But she carried most all of her neighbors on her books throughout the time. And in an interview, when she was a feisty, almost 98 years old, she said that every one of them paid her back in full except one. Now, another little tidbit. Rosa's daughter Catherine, after she married, she came back to live on the mountain, and Rosa bought her a house which was in the location of Iberia Bank today. Now, Rosa's home, she and Leonard lived in the vicinity where Miss Klingler's restaurant used to be, with those shops. And daughter Catherine had a daughter named Norma Brenneman, and after a few years, Rosa sold her property to a Mr. Warren, and he had a son named Mackie. And Norma Brenneman and Mackie Warren were the first couple to be married in that brand new Methodist church chapel. I love those kind of things. Now, I want to tell you about two other early settlers because of their legacies. The first, both of them were born the same year in 1867, but in different parts of the world. George Batty Ward was 4 years old when his family moved from Atlanta to the new city of Birmingham in 1871. They opened the Relay House, the first hotel. George grew up a very accomplished man who danced to his own drum beat. And he was very talented in the arts. He served in the city government for over a decade and a half, very progressive in his thinking as far as sanitation and health issues, the environment. In fact, he's the one who acquired most all of the green spots and the neighborhood parks that exist in Birmingham today, including all of that acreage out on Green Springs Highway for the George Ward Park. He was also an investment banker, but he loved to travel, especially to Italy, because he was a real scholar of the Greco-Roman history and literature. Well, returning from a trip, he brought back a model of the temple of the goddess Vesta, and he gave this to his architect, Mr. William Weldon. He said, "I want you to build me a home on my beautiful mountain top patterned after this model." And indeed, he had bought 20 acres of land up there in a beautiful site in 1923. Well, the builder was a Mr. George Paul. And I'm making another connection for you because I love to do that. Now, he had been very active in the development of the Hollywood section of Homewood. And do any of you remember, you better say yes, John and Gloria Hodo? Well, Mr. Paul was Gloria's father. Well, Mr. Ward also built his home of native materials, and he named it Vestavia. And I used to hear it was called Vestavia, but I've never been able to verify if it were. But Vesta, of course, goddess of hearth, via way, and it was his home by the wayside. He had the grounds landscaped into beautiful gardens, just filled with all kinds of, and all varieties of shrubs, and with sculptures located all around, goddesses, monuments, ornaments, urns, everything in the Roman theme, including his miniature Pantheon dog houses for his favorite dogs. And of course, he had peacocks. They were a rarity, and they strutted all around, including their neighbors' property and yards. But he also enclosed the grounds with a wrought iron fence that was just laden with climbing rose bushes. It perfumed the atmosphere for miles, I was told. He wanted everybody to come see what he had created up there. And it's legendary that he installed lights on this gate. Green meant come in, you are welcome. Just go around and see everything you want to. But if it were red, stay away. No visitors today. Now, in 1929, he built another temple structure. It was modeled after the Temple of Cybele in Tivoli, Italy. And it was located on the promontory of his property out the gates across the road. Now, it was very special. He intended for it to be his mausoleum, and he was to be buried in the cave underneath. But for the record, he's buried in Elmwood. Now, he loved to entertain. I forgot to show you his home, but of course most of you are familiar with his home. Those columns are made of screen covered with something like paper mache. He was into all the new and modern ideas, always. He loved to entertain, but if you attended one of his parties, you were expected to dress in appropriate attire, of course. That was Roman dress. And that included not only the guests who attended, but his household staff. And he even gave them names like Scipio, Lucullus, Pompey. And the entertainment might be beautiful young maidens dressed in, now where are my flowing gowns? Oh, here they are. Dressed in flowing gowns or tutus, dancing around the temple symbol. Now the stories just abound about Mr. Ward, and I know I've heard some that were fabrications, but I want to tell you one that was told to me, and I know it's true. It was told by Mr. John Eddings, who was an early resident, very active in community life, and he said when he was a lad that the preferred lover's lane of the era was that road around Mr. Ward's Vestavia. Now he learned about his night visitors, and he rigged up a speaker system and piped music out to them. Now the mothers learned about this, and if Johnny Jones or Jimmy Brown, whoever, missed his curfew, mother would ring up and she'd say, "George, you tell Jimmy I said to get home. Jimmy Brown, I said to get home." And Mr. Ward would get on the speaker system. And he'd say, "Jimmy Brown, your mother says to get home." Now, Mr. Eddings said that you could almost feel the tenseness even in your car of everybody waiting to see which vehicle would try to sneak away without turning its lights on. He never told me if he might have gotten one of those messages. Well, now the other early settler I want to tell you about, born the same year, but in faraway Poland. Louis Bazitz was 7 years old when he became an orphan. His mother and father died within 2 years. He said his father was a well-to-do leather merchant, so he was able to get a good education, go to school and to college. But at age 17, he went to work for a company and soon was the supervisor of 500 men. He saved his money, and when he had 1,000 rubles, he and another fellow decided they wanted to go into business for themselves. And in order to order as much material as they could, they decided to have the shipment in open boxcars. Well, that was in September when they placed the order, and it was in January when it came. He said that Poland had one of the most severe winters it ever suffered, and all of the material was completely ruined. And he was devastated and deep in debt. And he pondered his situation and finally decided that he would go to America and try to start over. Well, he wrote because he got tired of all those stories that were appearing in the paper about his life, and he wanted the facts known. He wrote that in early 1890s, he found himself without $1 in his pocket, walking the streets of New York for 3 days, sleeping on park benches, browsing in the garbage for something to eat. Now, on the 3rd day, he just happened to meet up with a woman from the same little hometown he was from in Poland. What do you call that? And Mrs. Frank told him that she had a business peddler's business back in Augusta, Georgia, and he could come work if he wanted to. And he said that he peddled jewelry for 2.5 years, saved his money. When he had $750, he decided he wanted to try to go into business himself. And he went to the little nearby town of Swainsboro. And in 5 years, he was worth $50,000. And he married in the meantime. And Mr. Bazette said, if you can do so well in such a small place, just think how much better you can do in the city. And she said it, and she said it, and she said it. Now, he was very happy in Swainsboro, but he got to thinking, now it's the 1890s, well, we don't have any conveniences, no water, no lights, and we are the only Jewish family around. So he got out and started visiting a few cities and decided to try Birmingham. He had absolutely no success, even when moving to a better location. He went to see his banker, and he received had an icy reception. Excuse me. Not as young as I used to be.
You're doing great.
And he said that he decided, well, I'll just lose everything I have, and then maybe she'll be happy to go back to Swainsboro. And he said that he had a manager who suggested he reduce prices. And at that time, domestic, and those of us who grew up poor know that it was a cheap sheeting to make your bed linens. Domestic was selling for 5 cents a yard, and he reduced it to 3. Took off just like that. He said he learned a lesson: sell for the lowest price you can. And at sometime, he discovered this beautiful mountain. And in fact, he owned a square mile of it, 640 acres. And you can see his home today, Happydale. It's in the Vestavia Parks apartment, and it's the administration building, but the entrance is the back of the home at that time. Now, what we know about Happydale is from an interview when Dr. Will David, a spark plug for the Historical Society in its early years, traced a Mr. Jack Jaffe down, who was a stepson of Mr. Pazette's. And he had a good interview with him. And Mr. Jaffe said that he came to Happydale in 1938 when his mother married Mrs. Pazette sometime after the death of the first wife. And he said there had been another home, as he understood it, but it had burned. And he didn't know where it was located, but Happydale was built in 1931 of native materials. He said it was a beautiful place, sat way back from the highway, shielding the estate, about a 15-acre estate, by a tall hedge. And between the hedge and the home, there was a huge circular rose garden. The grounds were well tended by a caretaker who lived on the property in a house with his wife, and the caretaker also had an assistant who lived on the place. He said there was a sloping walkway out back bordered by beautiful rock gardens that led down to a swimming pool filled with cold spring water. And in the valley beyond, there was an orchard of peach and pear trees, blueberry and blackberry bushes. And I'm sure there must have been a stable on the property, because he mentioned and talked about the pleasure it was for him and his sister to ride horseback in that beautiful country. And sometimes they were joined by 2 young people about their age, the only other family living in the whole area. You couldn't even see their house. But in 1943, the Pazette's family moved away from Happydale due to the severe gas rationing, and none of them ever returned. And now I have to start on another part, and you're going to have to pause and catch my breath. In 1946, when Charles Bird began his development, he called on the services of Walter Scholl Engineering and the Olmsted Brothers landscaping firm out of Brookline, Massachusetts, the builders of Central Park and the grounds at the U.S. Capitol. He wanted not only their expertise and advice for the residential development he was planning, but for future development. As he acquired property and built those conveniences and services that would help provide that good life that he aspired to for those who came. Well, and then began the platting and the digging and the blasting, continuously blasting from sun up till early evening, late evening. But in the spring of 1947, the first show home opened. And even that optimist Mr. Bird was astounded by the turnout. And one of those who came was Frank Burford. He came, he looked, and he stayed. He said that he and Rosie were so tired of being cramped up in the city. And he not only was an architect and designed homes, but he signed on as one of the salesmen. He said the main building material, though, was concrete block. And if I remember correctly, that was a creation, one of those many that came about during World War II with the ingenuity of all of those who were working full force to win World War II. He said wood was almost unobtainable. Well, now at this time on the mountain, the only school was the Montgomery School, which was located behind a little church, little Baptist church that we know today as that magnificent Shades Mountain Baptist Church. It was a 2-room frame building, 40 pupils attended, taught by 2 graduates of Birmingham Southern, excellent teachers, attested to by both Bill Moat and Nita Rush Cox. The children all walked to school. Now parents were becoming, the mothers were becoming very concerned about the safety of their children because the school was located on a rocky ground and in a steep, sharp curve. Now I don't have any information about whether traffic had begun to pick up after the war and there were rubber tires where people could roll again. But anyway, the mothers were so concerned about the safety that they went to the school board numerous times asking them to please find a safer place for the school. Finally, the board told them, we don't have any place to build a school. Well, that's all they needed to hear. They went straight to Charlie Bird. And he said, well, I have property, I'll sell them for a school. So, in the fall of 1949, the 4-room Vestavia Hills Elementary School opened, a faculty of 4, 3 full-time teachers, 1 who was part-time teacher, part-time principal, and 150 pupils showed up. Well, you do the math, and for the next 2 decades, it was my observation that on almost every school opening day, that scene was repeated. Now, also, Mr. Bird said he had no intention of buying the Vestavia Temple site that had been deserted for almost a decade. But there were those who urged him to do so because they were concerned that there were parties trying to get it for undesirable use. So Mr. Bird said he spent $200,000 cleaning up, repairing, restoring, hoping to turn it into a tourist attraction. In fact, he was planning an amphitheater and even located marble columns, which his friend Marshall Bergen hauled up there and and unloaded on the grounds. And they stayed there from 1950 to 1988. Mr. Byrd was disappointed, he said, that his dream for a tourist attraction did not occur. However, it was a rather popular upscale restaurant for several years, but most of the folks who ate there were locals, residents, and so that was one of his failures that he regretted. Now, his daughter, Patricia Byrd Jones, in speaking to the Historical Society, told us that Mrs. Ewan Steele was a caterer there, and she had created the most wonderful orange rolls that could ever be. And when that restaurant closed, she went to the club as a caterer. Now you know. Well, it's in the early 50s now, and Mr. Byrd and his committee that tried to attend to the increasing needs of this growing area decided that it was time to pursue perhaps incorporation. There needed to be more authority in the decision. And so much was needed to help provide that good life that he aspired to. So they took care of all the requirements, like a census, defining the area to be that qualified to be annexed, and then an election was set, and finally, when everything was completed, on November the 8th, 1950, the little town of Vestavia Hills found a place on the state map. Now, the decade of the 50s was a time of growth, optimism, and community spirit. In fact, by 1953, 2 churches were founded. First, the Methodist, then the Episcopal, and by the end of that decade, there were 5 churches. That included the Baptist Church, because they purchased the site of the Vestavia Temple, then Southminster Presbyterian, and the Lutheran. Civic clubs were being formed. The most active garden clubs in every neighborhood. The Boy Scouts, and a PTA that you could only dream about. And boy, were they needed, because the Board of Education provided the building, the desk, and the salaries of the teachers. And this was the smartest, most creative group of mothers that could ever be. And by the time the Montgomery Highway was 4-lane in the mid-50s, you began to find more and more people coming to the mountain. It was much more attractive to them. Things were happening. New City Hall was built. And in 1956, October, Mr. Byrd opened his first shopping center. That was a little bit of heaven come to the mountain. There was a grocery store, a drugstore, a hardware store, and some other little shops. But by the end of that decade, in 1959, he had completed a second addition. A posh ladies' dress shop, another grocery store, many shops and for service and sales. It couldn't get any better, could it? Well, most of those coming were young couples with growing families. And among them were many young men who were energetic, educated, enthusiastic, and wanting to have a part, a voice in the direction of the growth of the city. So you began to hear. Those old fellas up there aren't taking care of the needs of this community. Our children need playgrounds. They need parks. We need a civic center. Well, those old fellas were already looking for land for a park. And eventually, they persuaded Edna and Mildred Wald to sell them some property. Now, Miss Edna and Miss Mildred divided the property into two parcels. It was 32 acres. It would be $3,000 an acre, and they could buy one or both of them. But on the parcel that was abutting their property that they still owned, there would be a restriction. No fire station, no maintenance buildings, and no school. Well, now, how do you think the reaction of the community might be then when the council announced their accomplishment in the purchase of this land? Well, just look at that terrain. How in the world are you going to have a park or a playground there on that property? Oh, they paid too much for it. Isn't that outrageous? And it's not even in the city. Well, that was true. Southminster Presbyterian Church was the western boundary of the highway, and on the east, the boundary was the location, the site that had already been selected and plans approved for the post office or in the immediate environs. Well, come election night, there was a new mayor and 3 new council members. I'm sorry.
Would you like to take a break for a little while?
No. I bet you all would.
No, we just,
Well, they spent,
but you sit down when you want to.
that council spent that next decade developing that property. But before they could get into that, the PTA mothers descended upon them. It was critical, the severe shortage of classroom space. In fact, when the rumors began that the board was thinking of having split sessions for the elementary children, they visited the Methodist Church. They were not shy either, you see. And actually, the city council had given up their brand new chambers one year for a classroom. Well, the church agreed to let them use their classrooms, their own Sunday school classrooms, for school. And that went on for almost 2 decades also. But those mothers approached the city council, pleading with them to intervene with the school board to do something about the credit situation. Well, at last, something was accomplished. In fact, there were 2 additions, but only because the city council agreed to pay half the cost of construction. Now, the first ball field was built by fathers, and so was the second in the park. But the city did pay the expenses. A swimming pool was built, tennis courts, and then plans began for that long-awaited, the library everybody's pushing for, and that civic center. And finally, on Sunday, April the 13th, 1969, the library was dedicated. And 2 or 3 months later, that state-of-the-art civic center. But, retracing, something happened in the early 60s that was later of consequence. The heirs of the heirs of Mr. Lewis Bazitz were selling their estate, and they deeded in consecutive years property to the city. Also, do you remember that in the mid-60s, Vestavia Hills was a shopping mecca? Mr. Byrd built the 3rd addition in 1965 to his shopping center, anchored by Parisian, Sears, Yeildings, and a host of very much appreciated specialty shops and stores. You didn't really have to go off the mountain to buy your necessities. And Mr. Todd opened his mall on the western side, and there was mall opened by the Warrens, also on the western side. Do you all remember that? How wonderful it was? And that lasted at least through the 70s. I think I have reached the point where I want to read the rest of it. But, Chief, I forgot to tell you one great thing that was happening also in the 1950s. That City Hall, those members of the City Council had laid a solid fiscal foundation, but they had done so much more with all the requirements to get everything in the works for a really functional community. Of course, by now we had a police chief, and he had 3 assistants. Chief Haynes, the kids just loved him because every morning he was out there stopping the traffic on 31, letting the children pass, and they would all be exchanging waves and smiles. And then we had the fire department was established. Chief Ayers had 2 or 3 assistants who were paid, but the majority of all the firemen were young, healthy, very responsible volunteers. Now, Chief Ayers was endeared by the women of the community. Who else would come and get your cat out of the trees? Or come and unlock your house so you could get in, you'd lock yourself out? Or fish your keys out of the grate in the parking lot? Or if you had driven 200 miles away on vacation and suddenly remembered you left an appliance plugged in, would go to your house and unplug it for you. Well, he continued this throughout his term. I don't think it was so popular with all of his firemen, though. But he was beloved. Well, getting into this part that I want to read to you, if you don't mind. In the middle 60s, can you hear me? The entire over the mountain was increasing rapidly in population. And Jefferson County Board of Education could not build schools and classrooms fast enough to accommodate that increase in enrollment. The Newberry Junior Senior High School was overflowing. The campus was filling with trailers, and the school board was searching for a location to build a separate junior high. Their futile search led Vestavia Hills city officials to invite a look at the recently acquired property from the Possets. A school would fit the donor's request that the land be used for public good. The county school board accepted the offer, and it's recorded in the city council minutes that the council recommended the school be named Louis Possets Junior High. The first phase of the school building opened in 1968, and the board announced the name Vestavia Hills Junior High. Well, the last portion of the school was ready for occupancy in 1969. In 1970, the Vestavia Hills school system was formed, and the city assumed possession of the 2 schools within its borders, Vestavia Hills Elementary and Vestavia Hills Junior High. The vote to impose a tax to help fund the new system, a requisite of the governing body of the city, passed by a very narrow majority. 219 votes separated, and just a little over 3,000 votes were cast. And it was about 8,000 at the time. And you do the math now. All of those under 21 could not vote. And you remember the people coming had lots of children. And all of those under 6 were not going to school. So you could see there weren't many eligibles who didn't vote. With that cloud, multiple unceasing challenges descended the moment Superintendent Clark assumed duty. Housing the students, a lawsuit from Jefferson County Board claiming title to the upcoming school taxes, refusal of the county school board to allow phase-in of the high school grades that they had accorded the other breakaway systems. The Justice Department came with its conditions for integration and transportation, but no challenge loomed larger and more overwhelming than finding a location to build a high school. The search was intense. Every lead led to a dead end, and board members could not move about in the city without anxious parents asking, "You gonna find a place for high school?" That junior high school was housing 6th through 12th grade. Every broom closet, every space available. They were utilizing them for classes. Well, one morning, well into the first semester of school, Superintendent Clark was riding with a realtor in search of a site to build his home. Driving along, he remarked about the beautiful woody property they were passing, and he was informed it was not in the city. It belonged to the Bazitz family. Now, Mr. Clark immediately returned to his office, summoned all the city officials and the school board, and he apprised them of his discovery. School board member attorney Douglas Coretti had a long-time professional relationship with the Bazitz, and he agreed to make them aware of the city's need. In fact, he was the attorney who that was involved with the transfer of that property back in the 60s, mid-60s, on which the junior high school was built. In due time, Mr. Coretti returned to an anxiously awaiting mayor and council and school board, and with the news that Mr. Isidore and his wife, Mrs. Hortense, had agreed they would give 30 acres for the high school. There was a condition that it be named Louis Bazitz High School. Now, after much pause and discussion, Mr. Coretti agreed to revisit the Bazitz with a counter-proposal. Before many days passed, the council and school board were called together to hear his message. He reported that they said, "Yes, we realize the city would prefer its high school to have its name, perhaps the only high school the city will have. And we agree that it may be named Vestavia Hills High School, providing the middle school will be renamed Louis Bazitz Middle School." Now, this was a pivotal moment in the future of our school system, in my judgment. And what do you call a happening like this? Fate? Dumb luck? Translated, the hand of God, like a friend said, or a miracle? Now, this is my sentiment. I believe that saved our school system, and we are the beneficiaries of the penniless Polish immigrant, Louis Bazitz, whose property holdings became the site of our high school, the middle school and playgrounds, and the playgrounds around Central Elementary School. Now, I will stop if you want me to, but I do have one more story.
We don't want you to stop.
Okay, well, I'm going to catch you up on another event I referred to earlier. You remember the Walsh sisters and their restriction? Well, in 1976, there was a critical need for a second elementary school. Actually, there'd been one from the beginning. The coffers of both the city and the school boards were drained. It cost a lot of money to maintain, much less open a new system. And the city considered a tax referendum, promising that the garbage fee would be eliminated. Finally, consent was given to the school board to add 2 1/4 meals for school building purposes. The referendum passed, and I want to tell you that the city fathers sat back and let the school board members sell that idea to the community. And they were very vigilant in doing it. The referendum passed. The school board began planning for the new building in the city park. It was not, because it was not being developed for lack of funds. Then it surfaced that that would be impossible. A restriction existed prohibiting a school building on that portion. Well, knowing that Miss Edna and Miss Mildred were still living gave hope that they would lift that restriction. Their representative approached them, and our city attorney, city and school board attorney, tried his charm, and that was Robert Vance, who later became Judge Vance of the district court. But they remained firm. Finally, a young city councilman decided he would pay a personal visit and explain the situation. Now, I know they were charmed the minute they opened that door. Most graciously, he was invited in, served refreshments, and asked, "How can we help you, Mr. Boone?" And he told them the news of the city, how it was growing, how all were working together, especially how his little wife and her garden club friends had accomplished the building of a playground for their tots, and that it was in a corner of that beautiful park named for their papa. How mothers, fathers, neighbors, friends had come together donating and doing all the work because there were no city funds. He knew they were interested in city activities because they had attended council meetings in the past, and they always referred to the land we gave for the park that the city had paid $96,000 for. Then he explained how tight finances were, how great the need for the school, and he asked, "Miss Edna, Miss Mildred, won't you do this for us?" They couldn't refuse, could they? And they said, "Yes, Mr. Boone, we will." And I dare not imagine what arrangements for a school could ever have come about if young Councilman Pat Boone had not made that fortuitous effort. And you know, that's the way it has been with the members of this city and community forever. At least that's the ones I know have acted very appropriately and in the best interest of the community. Now, the Vestavia Temple Church was raised in 1971. There was no way to continue repairing it. And of course, there was a hue and a cry all around, "Save that historical building." But nobody would even come and try to take it apart and haul it away. So they had to raise it. And soon after, it was known that the church would be interested in disposing of the temple, that smaller temple, civil temple. And the Vestavia Hills Garden Club had been searching and looking, trying to find something that would give that would denote in some way the city that would tie in with its name. So their president went to the elders of the church and requested the temple, and they gave it to him. If you can move it away, you can have it. Well, eventually, they just got busy trying to raise money, having all kinds of fundraisers. Finally got up to about $10,000. All the garden clubs were pitching in helping. And they talked to one of the members' husbands, Bill Harbert, and he agreed that he would try to move it. Well, it was a much more difficult task than he ever dreamed, because though, I told you the pillars of the Vestavia Temple were made of like chicken wire and covered with paper mache almost, but these were solid concrete. So it was difficult moving them in the first place and getting them hauled down Montgomery Highway. But then when it came time to getting them lifted and up on that mound, he had to have a special piece of equipment made. He did call on a lot of his friends, and they helped him too. It actually cost him about $85,000 plus about $10,000 for those who helped him. But he said, no, that $10,000 wouldn't go very far. He would just do it. So it was dedicated on April the 8th, 1976, and maintained by the Vestavia Hills Garden Club for years. They formed a foundation, but the city makes a good contribution now in maintaining it too. Now, the monument at the southern end of the entrance of 31. Now, Miss Ruby Denson, you can tell about that because she was a leader of that group that was trying to come up. Well, actually, the first charge was to find a landscape architect to try to beautify the median, the highway. And Woodbird learned about it, and he asked to come to the meeting. So he came, and he expressed an interest there in having something at the southern end that would carry out the theme that was at the northern entrance. And he mentioned the columns. And Ruby and the council president approached the church elders. And I had wondered all those years what in the world those columns were doing lying out there on that ground. So I think one or two were standing, but most of them were lying. And eventually they gave the columns to the city. But there were a lot of steps before anything could happen. The highway department had to approve it, and they mulled it for a long time because they didn't know whether they might need it in the future. And they wanted to be sure that there would be no parking in the area. It was just in too dangerous a location. But they gave permission, and a committee was formed to study and come up with a plan for the design. But Woodbird had his own ideas, and he sent a photographer, an architect photographer, to the Vatican in Rome to photograph the Bernini colonnade. And he came back and made a design that would be a portion of that colonnade that extended from the front of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. And then he engaged a friend to come and clean up. He hauled all those columns up there. Engaged a friend to come and clean them up and prepare them. He paid for the whole thing, $250,000 he spent, just about. And that was at a time when they were in bankruptcy. All this bird development was about to end in Vestavia Hills as far as shopping. And the city maintains it today, and it's a beautiful site, I do think. And I was so happy when all those letters were removed from it. I don't mind, I love that Vestavia Hills on there. But Bird was asked about it, and he said, well, what's supposed to be in the writing on there? Well, I think that's enough, don't you? Because it's just supposed to be through the first 25 years.